Hello everybody. So we are on the chapter on consciousness, and in this brief video I will review a few important facts about sleep. So the place that I want to start with is the circadian rhythm, which is basically a 24-hour cycle that is associated with a number of physiological changes that happen in the body, such as temperature, arousal, energy, and mental sharpness. And this is a cycle that repeats itself every 4 or 24 hours and that we all are very familiar with. And when it comes to sleep hygiene, it's very important to be mindful of these particular changes so that we can develop a routine of sleep and rest that is most conducive to a sufficient amount of sleep and rest. Okay? So how do we measure sleep? It turns out that there is a device called electroencephalogram, or EEG, that allows us to place electrodes on the scalp and measure the brain activity in the cerebral cortex. And before we actually talk about sleep, I'd like to talk about some of the wavelength patterns that are associated with states of wakefulness, okay? So it turns out that we do go through different stages of sleep. I'm not going to show you this particular slide for too long. And before we get to sleep, we actually need to discuss sort of two relevant wakeful cycles here, okay? So when we are active and alert, we are in waking beta. So for example, now as you're watching this video, ideally you are in waking beta. You're alert, you're focused, you pay attention. And it turns out that's not a good brain state to try to go to sleep from. So before we fall asleep, we want to be for at least 30 to 60 minutes in what we call waking alpha, which is a deeply relaxed and more drowsy state associated with slower brain activity. And that is the kind of brain activity that you want to aim for before you go to sleep to improve your ability to actually fall asleep. So what's happening once we fall asleep? Once we fall asleep, we go through 4 stages. The first 3 are called non-REM. Okay, non-REM 1, 2, and 3. Stage non-REM 3 is a deep sleep stage during which we restore our body strength and energy. And as you see here on this particular slide, the brain activity gets slower as we fall asleep deeper and deeper. And then something really interesting happens. The next stage, the 4th stage, is called the REM sleep, rapid eye movement. That's what it stands for. And what's really interesting about rapid eye movement is that the brain looks as though we are awake, okay? And it's referred to as paradoxical sleep, and this is the paradox. The paradox is that the brain looks as though we are active and awake, and yet our body is paralyzed. And sleep paralysis is actually essential during REM sleep so that we don't act out our dreams and so that we just don't, move and jump off the bed and things like that. And that is the paradox. So when we talk about REM being paradoxical sleep, it's the fact that the brain is very active and the body is paralyzed, okay? So what happens? What happens at night is that every 90 minutes or so, our body goes through, or brain goes through, the cycle of 4 stages, okay? And that repeats itself several times per night. Okay. So I want to just briefly show you a slide that sums up some of the negative effects of sleep deprivation. It turns out that sleep deprivation is quite harmful to our brain and our body. Our brain is less able to focus, our immune system is jeopardized, we produce greater numbers of fat cells, there's increased inflammation in the body, which can influence autoimmune conditions. The heart can engage in more activity. Sort of high blood pressure is sometimes seen with sleep deprivation. Stomach increases all kinds of hunger arousing hormones that can increase our craving for certain types of food, and that is not very healthy for us. And finally, the muscles are less strong. I'm sure all of you are familiar with what happens to your body strength when you are sleep deprived. Okay, so those are important things to keep in mind because sleep deprivation is actually very harmful to us, especially to our long-term health. and it's important to figure out strategies that work to improve the quality of sleep. So here you have a list, okay? Here you have a list of sleep hygiene, which basically refers to the effective strategies for increasing the likelihood of effective and long sleep. Okay, so for example, turning the lights low and turning the screens off has to do with the fact that when that light stimulates the suppression of a hormone called melatonin, and a lot of screens in devices that we use actually have blue light, and Blu-ray light basically decreases the production of melatonin. And we want melatonin to be high when we go to sleep, because melatonin helps us go to sleep. So if you don't like to turn off your devices, you can turn on the feature that allows you to basically block out Blu-ray light, okay? You want to eat earlier. You don't want to drink alcohol because that will interfere with your REM sleep later on. You want to have a routine where you get up at the same time every day, exercise regularly. When people start exercising, they don't necessarily start seeing improvements in sleep right away. It can take up to 3 months for the improvement in sleep to show, but it's certainly very good for our body as well. So you may just as well do it if you need to improve your sleep. Don't check the clock basically refers to the fact that if you start thinking about what time it is and how little sleep you have gotten so far, you are going to get your brain into beta activity, which is the kind of level of activity that is not conducive to falling asleep. And so you want to be sort of as relaxed as possible in the effort to go back to sleep. Okay, so this is a list of useful strategies to think about. We're going to stop here for the day. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will see you next time.